I Barely Got Here is a collection of stories and conversations based on 24 years in law enforcement. You have the right to be disturbed by some of the content or disagree with the viewpoints. Anything you hear can and will be dosed with sarcasm and dark humor. You have the right to know that discussions will often be graphic with language and themes that are intended for a mature audience. Do you understand your rights? Then buckle up, Buttercup. We're going 10-8. This episode's brought to you by John Farron, a realtor with Home Smart Lifestyles in Queen Creek, Arizona. A retired police sergeant, John continues to help the community as he assists families with the sale or purchase of their homes in the Phoenix metro area. Whether you're a first-time home buyer, a seasoned investor, or somewhere in between, John has the experience, knowledge, and ability to safely guide you through the process. For a free, no-obligation consult, you can reach John at 480-458-7399, on the internet at www.eastvalleyproperties.net, or see him on YouTube at East Valley Properties with John Farron. Hello and welcome back to I Barely Got Here. I am your host, Kevin Booncher, and once again I got Jay in here with me. It's always a pleasure. Jay, if you want to say hey.
Happy to be here.
I really appreciate it, as always. You know, before we delve into the episode for today, I do want to share a review, and normally I'd throw this on, Facebook or Instagram or whatever, but for this one, I did want to share this one on the air, the episode. So I have a service that gives me reviews. It's, just something on podcast related. It tells you what reviews you get. So I do read them, and this one kind of jumped out at me. So here's the verbal. It's the title of the review is More Jay, and it's a 5-star review, which is always appreciated. But it says, this podcast is so good, and please make more podcasts with Jay, Jay is my grandpa.
That's hilarious. That's quite funny.
I loved it. So, of course, I had to tell Jay, and we quickly determined that this is his grandson's.
It is. I have 4 grandkids, 3 grandsons and a granddaughter, and I'm pretty sure this one was written or submitted by Easton and Tegan. They've recently started listening to some of your podcasts, and I know they've got a couple I was doing, and so it's full disclosure, it's very biased.
Yeah, that's what I love too. But so thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate that. And yes, of course, you have a great storytelling grandfather, no question there. But thanks again for that. And reviews are always appreciated for non-biased, regular folks, strangers too. So feel free to throw those out there if you would. All right, so with that, I want to get into this episode. And again, this is another one that Jay's going to carry the bulk of. This one is going to have some conversation about the professional athlete. And Jay has a ton of experience with this type of thing. And as we get into it, it'll make more sense. But I probably don't even have a tenth of the experience with this arena that Jay does. So I also like the stories that we're going to talk about today. But so tonight's episode is going to be titled Unsportsmanlike Conduct. So Jay, I'm going to let you just kind of start it off with whichever aspect of this you want to start with.
Sure. It's an interesting area of my business and exposure to individuals in the professional athletic field, whatever it may be. And I think I have to back it up to my years in law enforcement when we were doing a wiretap. Well, even before that, Kevin, you and I haven't worked the streets as long as we did. We always ran into, on occasion, professional athletes. And I don't know how your experiences went with them, but often my initial interpretation was they were a bit of a prima donnas, and they wanted special treatment whenever we were stopping them. And
pretty arrogant.
My experience with them was they were very arrogant. So it just reinforced some preconceived notions I had about them until I did this wiretap, and I saw a different side of the professional athletes world. In this particular case, it was a drug wire, and at one point during the intercepted phone calls between our main target, somebody who called him, we didn't know who that individual was at first. Our target got a phone call from a member of the Arizona Cardinals football team, and during the course of the conversation, it was pretty apparent that there was no drug talk between the two, which was very comforting. And so when there is no drug talk in a drug wire, you do what they call minimize. Yeah. So minimizing means you turn off the recording, you stop listening, and that also means you turn off the listening. You don't listen to the conversation, but if it goes on for any length of time, you jump back into it to make sure they haven't transitioned from talking about the weather to drugs. And so when the monitor jumped back into the call, they recorded conversations, or they listened to conversations between our target and the athlete, during which time the athlete was trying to borrow like $250,000 or $500,000 cash from our drug source, our drug contact, our target, which was, it was worth staying engaged in the conversation at that point.
That's not quite every day, and obviously you don't know that there's not some criminal angle to that. It's not every day that one friend calls another and says, I want to borrow that much kind of cash.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we stayed in the conversation, listened to it in its entirety, and it turned out the athlete was going through a divorce, and he wanted to borrow the money from our target in order to build a home for his single mother who was aging, and he wanted to build a home from her without his soon-to-be ex-wife knowing that monies were spent on his mom instead of their divorce settlement. So I just tucked that away in the back pocket, and that athlete never called again after that one call. However, the next call that was made from our drug target called a co-defendant in that case, and they discussed how this conversation and this request had been made, and they had decided to go ahead and give this athlete the money that he was asking to get their hooks into him, like they did headache, and that was all they said. And we were aware that there was an ASU basketball player who was a shining star that had been suspected of either not covering the point spread at a basketball game to the degree it was so obvious that he was missing a free throw that the bookies in Vegas stopped actually accepting bets on the game, and they shut it down. And so it was interesting, but it never went anywhere. But it opened my eyes to the other side of the coin, not the athlete just asking about the money. What happens to athletes or could happen to athletes. So I made a mental note that when this case wrapped up, I was going to make every effort I could to reach out to this particular player and have a conversation with him about who he thought he was talking to.
So I guess, part of, as I listened to you talking about this, and we talked about the fact that as you go through your career, you do have those interactions with professional athletes, and I have a few that I recall, and, we talked about, I think you kind of have that same mental image of what they are and who they are, that they're arrogant, that they're rich, because they have to be rich, right? They're professional athletes.
Exactly.
So they have to have just literally millions of dollars just sitting in the bank waiting for them to spend on, whatever whim they want to spend it on. And so, the first thing that jumps out about this conversation is, well, why are you calling a dope dealer to borrow $250,000? I mean, you should have that money readily available.
Right.
So again, I think it starts to open up that unknown, not understood financial position that probably the majority of these athletes are in at one point or time, disregarding what we think they should be. That's just not the reality,
right.
And I do remember that wire. We were chatting about that because I remember being a monitor on that wire and then doing some surveillance as well.
Right.
That guy was a shady dude.
Smart. Very smart.
Very smart.
And he actually came back into my life after that wire. Right before I retired, I did another case against that guy. And crazy enough, 15 years later, that same target had embezzled $8 million from somebody in Santa Barbara who found their way to me in Arizona and came back into my life. So
you know what?
It was crazy.
That's probably a good podcast because I know all the stuff you're talking about.
You do know about that one.
And if we went from start to finish, we're going to have to table that one because I'll bet you that'd be a good podcast.
It would be good.
Anywho, so back to the professional athlete issue. So you kind of tuck that away. Where did you go from there?
Well, being a case agent in a wiretap is like being a juggler. So with a lot of balls in the air. So once you stop juggling and you have all your legal requirements met and case requirements met, you have to notify people that were intercepted that we recorded a conversation between you and a target, and this gentleman was going to receive one of those notifications that he was intercepted. So I decided to call him in advance, reach out through the. I can't remember how I reached out. Well, we had his phone number. We were wiretapping him. So
there you go.
we were wiretapping the target. So I had his cell number. That's how I got him.
Yeah.
So I just called him. I introduced myself to him, and he was terribly nervous. And I told him I wanted to have a meeting with them to discuss this target's name. And I gave him the name of our target. And so I requested that he talk to his attorney and then schedule an appointment where a time that was conducive to he and his attorney come in and talk to me. And that ultimately happened. He and his attorney came in and met with me, and they were very nervous, because they were concerned about any legal liability they had, and I assured them they had none, but my big question to them was who he thought he was talking to. And so he explained to me that he thought this man who had made all his money in the drug business was a stockbroker, kind of a rich kid, ran around in Scottsdale. Mm. He had first met him at a club in Scottsdale. It was a big, hot, dancing young adult club at the time, and they had been to lunch, been to dinner together, and he had no idea that the source of funds for Anthony was, in fact, drugs. So then
Did you believe him?
He seemed very convincing, and he did. I mean, I've been fooled before, but he seemed quite honest and open with me. I explained to him who he really was, and then I played the recording, and I said, well, here's my concern. And I said, here's what happened the minute you hung up the phone. And I played the recording that we had made.
When he called his other
When he called his
associate.
other, and it was deeply disturbing. I mean, we listened to, and I watched this man, listen to this druggie talk about him, and I never heard so many, F-bombs and N-words dropped, and I mean, this man was shocked. And then he looked at it like he was shrinking in his chair, and he's a big man. On the field, they don't look nearly so big, but I do remember shaking this guy's hand. I felt like a little girl. My hand was just swallowed up, and he had a bear paw, as a hand. So he and his attorney were grateful that I took the time to talk to him, but it was a great learning experience for me. And I did ask him what kind of advice or counsel the league or the team gave him when he, doesn't the NFL protect you from things like that? And then he explained the in-house workings of their director of security and what happens when they have a problem. And basically, I felt like he was ill-protected and really he needed a day's worth of education that the league could only give him 30 minutes, by a retired cop who was the director of security over there. And
it was really far removed from really what's going on anyway.
Yeah, and the trouble was, over time I learned that these professional athletes, most of my professional athletes, clients that have come to me in the private sector are all products of broken families, been raised by very diligent and strong single women that shepherded their children to successful adulthood. But along the way, there were some lessons that should have been taught that, were never gained by these guys. And so they go from high school to college, to a team. And we on the outside that just see them on the field to play or a court, we look at them as they've got their stuff together. They're as professional off the field as they are on the field. And in reality, they're kind of, stunted in and outside of their arena world, or there's some things that they should know that they have never been taught.
Yeah, well, they've lived a non-realistic life in a lot of ways. They have perks and they have advantages and they have things that happen to them that it's not going to happen to you or I.
Exactly.
People treat them differently. They're able to make demands that the average person would never be able to make.
Right.
Oftentimes, they're helped with their academic career so that their number one priority, i.e. playing a game, continues.
Exactly. And we assume because they're college graduates that they're smart and educated. But like you said, they do get this kind of this pass, as they're going through college on their way to the profession. professional sports, whatever it may be.
Sure.
And my experiences have been mostly with football, basketball, and boxing. I haven't had any professional baseball player athletes. I don't know if they're smarter than the other athletes or they just have more involved agents or managers.
Yeah, maybe
or
the league.
Maybe the league pays more attention to them. And,
and I think that's one of the big things that I learned doing, like I said, my minimal stuff, but mostly from you and I talking about all this is how it seems like they really just kind of, they leave them out to float by themselves in the ocean of the unknown. I mean, they get into a legal issue or they get into a monetary issue or whatever, and it's like they don't know the first thing to do.
They don't, and that became really apparent with one particular athlete that I've helped mitigate a problem. They never should have been problems. Is that there were little things that festered into bigger problems. And the first time I met this guy after I'd retired was when my phone rang at midnight from a big law firm in Phoenix that I'd done a lot of work with, who asked that I would respond to a hotel in the middle of the night where they had their client athlete stashed, trying to solve a problem that had festered the day before and had a little deal turning into a big deal. So I got to view firsthand how the athlete is handled by the attorneys that they're placed with, and it was shocking. I mean, what I witnessed. I walked into this particular hotel with another football player who I didn't recognize, but was introduced to me as a member of the Arizona Cardinals team, and there were 3 attorneys in suits and ties at 1 in the morning that had dressed up for this guy, and the meter was burning at somewhere between $400 and $600 an hour at the time, and this was quite some time ago. And they were discussing strategies and how to mitigate this guy's problem.
Just so we can set the story, what was this guy's problem without, I guess?
I can share. And it's funny, I've actually had a recent conversation with this client who is actually a friend of mine now, and told him I'd like to share his experience, and he said, please do, because there's so many athletes that don't know what can happen to them, and he had basically told me, many times how he wished he would have listened to me at the end of the first problem he had, and this is the first problem he had that we're discussing. So his issue was quite simple. He was a shining star for the team. He was doing great things on the field. He had a beautiful girlfriend who he had given or loaned a $100,000 Lexus to, and their relationship was unwinding and unraveling, and he wanted his car back. And it was simple as that. And then he went over to get his car in the driveway of his girlfriend's house in another city here in the valley. And there was an argument over entitlement to the keys, and she slapped him, and he brushed off some slaps. There was no fist. There was no assaultive behavior of this man's part, but he did defend himself in a driveway, angry, spat, and left without the car. And she filed a police report with the local police department that got back to the league or the team, and the team notified him that this agency was filing an assault charge against him.
So I want to just kind of at this point take just a second to explain. And again, this is from our conversations, is mainly how I understand it. Is when you got this professional athlete, that there's one side of it is the fact that there's been a criminal incident that took place, whether it's a legit criminal incident or it's more like this one which I know this guy as well. He's a pretty good guy. There's really no merit to this assault case.
There was an allegation of a crime.
There's an allegation. So there's that you're dealing with already. So the average person, that's really all you'd end up dealing with. But when you start talking about an athlete who has to negotiate and sign and renegotiate and re-sign contracts on a semi-regular basis, a big chunk of that is essentially kind of how their persona is viewed. How are these guys viewed? Are they a good athlete? Or are they a bad athlete? Are they going to bring good attention to the team, or are they going to bring bad attention to the team? So these athletes, whether they think about it or not, which I don't, again, I think the league falls short of helping them understand these bigger pictures. Take this guy. This could have a serious financial impact on his next signing or his next contract
Huge.
or anything, even if he did nothing wrong.
Exactly.
And I think that they, I know that they don't understand the ramification
Right.
of the fallout of that, which it, further again makes it such an important aspect that these poor guys just don't know.
Yeah, they don't know, but the facts of life are explained to them quite vocally at 2 o'clock in the morning in a hotel where you're being hid while 3 men in suits charging you $1,500 for this advice an hour are running the meter when they're explaining to you that you need to focus on your brand and this needs to go away as quickly as possible. Otherwise, your brand is tarnished, diminished, or completely destroyed. And so when they tell you, I'm going to charge you $60,000 to defend you on this misdemeanor assault, you happily write the check to that man because your team has told you that this is the man they would use to handle their problems. But the trouble is, they're handling a $6,000 problem or a $7,500 problem, not a $60,000 or $75,000 problem. Yet the fear of God is put into these kids where they feel that's all they can do is break out the checkbook, the credit card, whatever it may be, and fork over their money because they've put themselves in a very untenable space.
Yeah. Or they didn't put themselves in it, someone else did. But
exactly.
here
But
and there.
they don't know how to get out of it.
They don't know how to get out of it. And I
point.
think, and I'm sure you would agree with me as well, that probably the majority of the times the attorney that is found for them, in quotes, by the league or by whoever is probably not even the correct attorney for them to use.
Without exception, well, I won't say that. One attorney that's handled one of my professional clients was the right man for that job, who handled a basketball player on the West Coast and who had a problem in Tempe, in Arizona, who I eventually fired the client just because I couldn't stand him not answering the phone and talking to me when I was trying to help him. So I stepped away from that case because, mommy was still sheltering that athlete, and I just couldn't stomach his behavior when he had a whole team trying to help him. So I stepped away from that one. But this one is, this one was different. This one was, he needed some stick handling and some help.
Yeah, but it's a great example of just how they go. When they start off wrong with the wrong people helping you out, it just makes things so much more difficult.
Yeah, and so, his issues weren't that big. It wasn't that hard to unravel this, but unfortunately, I do remember taking another meeting with the lawyer and this man's mom who had flown out from the East Coast to listen to the attorney, to talk about the troubles her son was in. And I remember looking at that mom thinking, oh my God, this mom had put all her effort into this child and had done the right thing. And she raised 2 or 3 other great children. One was a federal judge, one was a doctor, and I remember the look at her look as a parent. I am a parent, but looking at her going, man, this, my boy hurt himself and what he did. And this attorney is still fanning the fire of fear. These are the bad things that could happen. And I mean, I just wanted to grab him and run him out of there and take him somewhere else that, would mitigate his problem every bit as good as this guy did, but for a fraction of the cost. But
yeah, because obviously an attorney, again, we could go down the long road of attorneys, but a lot of them, they're in the job to make money. And the more severe, the more scary they can make things is just going to translate into more dollars.
Fear of incarceration and fear of financial loss, when you're being told by a man in a, $5,000 suit and a skyscraper and Persian rugs all over the marble floor, it's a very convincing conversation. And
so you don't blame him.
And you're scared. No, you listen to him. So his problem eventually went away. It worked out. But before I stepped away from the case, I remember my last contact with the athlete over that particular case was I was at his house. And he was probably settling up with me. He probably owed me a little bit of money, in that case for some work I'd done. I remember there were 6 other guys in his house and asking him, I said, you could have avoided, or telling him, you could have avoided this. There is a way to avoid this. And I threw a strategy out about how you ought to have a guy like me, if not me, a guy like me in your corner on retainer to help you navigate these issues as they come, because they always pop up. Athletes are too busy running down the field, spending their money, dealing their life, but they have a circle, they have a posse, they have some Klingons, for lack of a better term, that find a way into their life that they end up putting far more reliance in these people than they should. In this particular case, I go, who made this decision for you? And he pointed to a young man out in his house, and I said, what do you do? And he goes, I own a limousine company. I go, how much education do you have? He goes, 8th grade. And I applauded him for turning 8th grade education into a business. I go, but you have no business making this man's decisions for him.
Right.
So, and there was really an easy way to get this resolved. And I told him, I said, do you have a spare set of keys to your Lexus? He goes, I do. I said, I'll go get your car back for you. He goes, well, she had reported stolen. I go, it's your car. Yeah. She can't report it stolen. I've seen her. Yep. She's tan. She's got a great butt. She's in the gym and tanning all the time. So when she's tanning or working, doing squats, I'll go bring your Lexus back to you. And I just saved you, $70,000 by the time you were done.
Yep.
Because I was worried about his star, his brand being diminished. And it was, in later years, a decade later, he circled back to me on another issue, and he told me, I should have listened to you that day in my house, because exactly what you predicted was going to happen to me happened. And I sat on the bench. I was in every play before. I sat on the bench for a year, then sent to another team. And before you knew it, it affected me negatively in my career.
It's a domino effect.
It is.
And sometimes it's, it's kind of defeating that, these guys, again, they're used to being praised. They're used to being truly the best of the best once you reach that level. But you have that one chink in the armor. And sometimes these guys never recover from it.
Right.
It's really sad. But give me another story. Give me some other stories of how you've been involved with some of these guys.
One particular boxer has been my client twice, and he's pretty well known. And most of his problems were self-induced. And he, again, had another big law firm that represented him, and he didn't care about the money he was paying. So some of his, he kept shooting himself in the foot, basically. Once we recognize athletes, and I'm not a big sports fan. I don't follow, them at sports. But when you see somebody in the field, you see somebody at a ball game that you're at, I'll recognize a Larry Fitzgerald, and yet I've never met him. So some of these athletes are so recognizable. And the athletes that are very recognizable, that have a history of making real poor decisions, at times becomes a target of opportunity from somebody that wants to push the right button on a guy to elicit some sort of behavior from a guy into a civil settlement, into a monetary reward for being punched. And this particular guy could never go out in public. Well, he could go out in public, but he had a habit of going to a lot of strip joints. And, people would recognize him in the strip joints and start poking at him. Pretty soon he poked back. And then
his poke was a lot harder.
Oh, yeah. He could poke.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then those lead into the same tragic scenario of events, and a couple of instances with this gentleman that were similar to that, and every one of them was self-induced. He would just never quite learn, that he probably ought to stay out of a strip joint, to put himself in, if you're a crack addict, you don't put yourself, near a crack pipe. You just are, and he was not, but unfortunately he had a weakness, and his weakness was, naked or half-naked women in that setting, and people took advantage of him.
Well, and two, you have to, right or wrong, whether you agree with it or not, the majority of these people are young men who didn't mature properly at, probably no fault of their own, but just the way their lives unfolded, in part being a pampered athlete. That you don't mature properly when you're pampered through almost every aspect of your life. So, you take a person like that, and they're going to make bad decisions. I mean, they're going to go places they probably shouldn't go. They're going to hang out with people they shouldn't hang out with. And they're going to take the advice of that pal, friend, hanger-on, groupie, whatever, over somebody, that normally you'd look and say, that person probably knows better, but they just don't see it that way.
Right.
They see that coming from that buddy, that pal, that limo company owner, friend that has absolutely no legal experience, but they're going to go, yeah, what do you think?
It's terrible. I mean, who they rely upon for decisions,
Yeah.
as well as I've had a number of athletes, and not just athletes, but lose money because everybody knows they have money, whether it's league minimum, even league minimum for any professional sports is a lot of money. But once they've been in their profession for a while and it's succeeding, it just more and more and more and more money comes their way, and more opportunity, and more people never telling them no. And they love being that focal point too. I mean, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of doom that, the more they get stroked, the easier it is to pick their pocket too.
Sure.
So I've had a number of occasions where clients come to me, professional athlete clients, that they've been fleeced, not out of all their money, but by a big chunk of money, and whether it's by family members or somebody that was just in that, not in the X ring if we were shooting at the range, but in the in the outer range, 9 and 8 ring.
Sure.
So. These guys will come to them and, I got a great opportunity for a car wash. I got a great opportunity for this franchise, makes this amount of money. And they're just like, oh, what do you need? I'll give it to you. It's a great opportunity, and we'll just, here, I'll fund it. And then they never see a penny of it back.
Right,
and
right.
So
it is. But we have talked about, too, I think a lot of them fall back on the single mother for advice, too, which is not in and of itself, on its face, a bad move. But again, this is a lot of times it's a single mother that she doesn't have any legal understanding, but she's trying to do what she's done for this kid his whole life, which is guide him and do the right thing,
Exactly. And these young adults, you're right, the single mother, you and I have had this conversation on occasion over the years, that if we or I or you shifted a business model, toward just the professional athlete, we should probably target the single mother of that athlete, because they have a vested interest emotionally and financially to make sure that Junior stays clean and is successful as long as they can be successful in professional, especially football. In football, you're only as good as your knees will hold up your body. In any professional sport, you're only as good for as long as your body holds up. And so you have finite resources, your body, in a limited time that they're going to be performing at optimum peak performance. So you got to take advantage of that and be wise during those years. And it's tragic how many athletes leave a profession after 5 or 10 years or whatever long they're blessed to be in that profession, and they end up flat broke or not nearly as comfortable as they should be if it's not flat broke.
Filing bankruptcy and some of these other problems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's just a real sad state of affairs. So,
well, I was just going to say, you had a professional boxer, which I know who you're talking about, the football player. Now, we had another incident with the one football player as well.
We did.
Which was recent, because I actually worked with that on you, if you want to start on that.
Yeah, that one was a prior client of mine who I recognized on TV from a booking picture that they had decided to float out there on the 6 o'clock news one evening. A booking picture from the city of Scottsdale, and he had been arrested in downtown Scottsdale for domestic violence or some, assaultive behavior. I just felt terrible seeing him there, so I reached out to him, and I had some contact information to find out if he was okay. I mean, I genuinely was concerned that he was okay, and since I had represented him in the past on another matter, I wanted to make sure he was properly placed, unlike the prior incident that he had. He just was with the wrong team before, and he told me who he had retained, and it was a different attorney. He was a real big name here in the community that charges a lot of money for his services. And once again, I felt that this man was falling into the same hamster wheel of behavior, not knowing who to turn to. He was no longer a professional athlete. He had retired, but he still had a problem he had to mitigate. And so I asked him if he wanted me to help him, and he did. And so I ultimately took him to an attorney that I respected and admired and had known for decades in the defense world, and he changed ponies. So he got his money back from the expensive pony, and he went with a better attorney, I feel.
Better in a number of ways.
In a number of ways.
Yeah.
And so I know what the retainer was he was charged, by one man, and I know what the other man charged him that he ultimately went with, and it was just, the difference was just astronomical.
Yeah.
And the case was dismissed. That case got a complete dismissal.
Yeah.
But it wasn't after a lot of fighting, because you helped on that case. You interviewed, I think, a
Cabbie
driver, because that particular case. Man leaving a club downtown Scottsdale, walking away from his drunk girlfriend who was physically abusive by many witnesses that I spoke to and you spoke to, the cabbie, tried to break. She was grabbing his shirt and tried to pull away from the shirt grab. She tumbled, did a drunk stumble in the street that was viewed by another drunk woman and a bouncer who saw just one frame of the movie, not the whole frame, not the whole movie.
Right.
While our client walked down the street, hailed a cab, and I'll let you tell, what did that cabbie tell you? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. Well, he was pretty colorful. That guy was funny. He, I won't use the exact language, but he was saying that our guy hadn't done a thing, and that the one thing he was telling him was, you need to get out of here. And of course, our client's like, well, why do I need to get out of here? I didn't do anything wrong. And he's like, well, basically, you're a big black guy in downtown Scottsdale. So, you're going to be looked at.
You're going to jail.
You're a target, and
Yes.
you're going to go to jail. Exactly. And so he was like, yeah, you need to get out of here. The cabbie thing was interesting. And I always remember this case because the cabbie had such a different angle and a different view of this incident. He was the best witness, honestly.
Yes.
Comparative to the doorman, comparative to the girlfriend, comparative to even the drunk girlfriend, really. He gave great detail. And once you'd listen to this guy, it made it perfectly clear that our client hadn't done a thing.
He was innocent.
He was innocent, but it's the old misconceptions are hard to break, that if you see a big guy in any kind of a struggle with a woman, we immediately assume it's the big guy that's committing the crime or doing the wrong or assaulting or whatever else. It's just the way it is.
And she had been completely inappropriate at several other clubs prior to
Leading up to
this, where she was beating on him inside a club. She was jealous. She was jealous of some attention that this man garnered from other females that were in the club, and he wasn't being inappropriate with his behavior. She was just impaired, and she didn't realize he wasn't being improper, and they're still together to this day. They're still together.
Isn't that crazy?
So anyway, that particular cabbie suggested that he leave. Our client said, "No, I'll stay here." He sat on the curb, waited till Scottsdale PD got there. Scottsdale PD got there and interviewed a really drunk lady. They interviewed a really drunk purported victim who had no physical injuries on her, who told the police, "I don't know what he did. This drunk lady told me he hit me," and interviewed the bouncer that said, "I saw a punch," and he didn't see a punch. And so did basically the body cam video on that was like a minute and 30-second interviews with some of these witnesses they did. And most of that was just biographical, what's your name and number, who you are. And anyway, that guy was taken to jail. He was booked into jail. And we had to go through the process many, many times to the city attorney. It was just a misdemeanor. The city attorney in Scottsdale, the prosecutor up there, would not let go of it. And I have to say, it's my experience when I've seen this too happen in law enforcement, when cops grab a professional athlete, sometimes they hang on a little bit tighter than they would Joe Schmo.
Like almost they're trying to prove the point that we're not going to let this person be a normal person.
Yes.
Yeah. We have to prove something.
And it's a better story to tell on the weekend that I arrested this professional athlete than it is just some regular citizen for anything. So a lot of them, I'm not making excuses for bad behavior. I'm just saying I've seen cops do that on occasion, and I've seen prosecutors will not give up on a weak case if they have somebody that has a significant brand or some name recognition in the community. Because, again, I think they can brag about it that I prosecuted so-and-so. And so ultimately the case was dismissed as the bouncer was out of state. and would not come back. By this time, he had kind of, softened his tone on what he claimed to see so brilliantly that night. And ultimately, the case was dismissed.
Which was proper.
It was.
From what we knew. And so, well, we already discussed. Let's change our client into just average Joe Schmo that had some kind of an altercation with a drunk girlfriend that night. Do you think anybody would have went to jail?
I think maybe. Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there was a racial color thing, because I have seen, sometimes that a black man, in a downtown Scottsdale area, and may go to jail quicker than a white man will go to jail. And I hate to admit that some of the cases that have been presented to me that I've seen, they all go to jail, but it seems like a black man might go to jail a little bit quicker than the white man. Now, in this particular case, I think if you or I had been alleged to have done that to our date or women, whatever, we probably would have gone to jail, but they would have interviewed people a little bit more depth. They would have done a little bit more digging into the investigation work than on this particular night, But then again, it just could be the environment. You work downtown Mill Avenue when it was just crazy, and cops don't have as much time sometimes to devote the resources to.
And it's funny you say that, because that was kind of the angle that I was looking at was, when you're doing that job and it's just nutty and there's fights and there's things going on, sometimes you would, and I'll be the first to admit it, you try to get out of that. You try to find a reason to basically say, you know what, we can't arrest anybody. You guys just go your separate ways, get out of here and go away.
That's good to hear.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's like a mutual combat situation.
Exactly. And that does happen, obviously. And there are situations where you go to something and we call it the he said, she said, where there's an alleged assault, but both are alleging. And oftentimes you have to come down on the side of, I can't prove one way or the other. I don't know what happened. We're going to document it. You guys go your separate ways.
And this is a case where he should have been let go of that. There was no injury of this woman. There was no physical mark on her body. She said he didn't hit me. And I don't know what he did other than that this lady here said he hit me. But she had no memory. And she never ever did manifest any bruising or any mark on her body.
Yeah.
So this particular night, that man should not have been arrested. He should not have gone to jail. And at worst, they should have picked people up, called them a cab, put them in 2 separate Ubers, sent them on their own way, and dust everybody off and say, go home, stop being drunk. Don't be drunk here anymore.
Well, and I think part of the problem too is we've law enforcement, and again, there's some reason for it, but sometimes it goes too far. But over the years, the cops would respond to those domestics, and basically they would just walk away from them. Sometimes when there was obvious signs of an injury, an assault, a crime, or whatever, and then later on we'd find out that someone got killed, or you'd find out that someone really got beat to hell. So, law enforcement went farther and basically said, no, we're going to mandate that, everybody calls it a different thing, but we're going to mandate if it's a domestic violence situation and there's any possibility that you can take someone to jail for the night, you're going to do it.
And that could have played into this, because they did ask her if they cohabitated with one another, even though they weren't married yet. Do you cohabitate?
Yeah.
So, but they in that particular case, they still should have done more digging.
Oh, I agree.
And even if they took him to jail, booked and released, they should have, a supervisor later should have reviewed their report and cleared it, like exceptionally cleared it, or just been done with it. Certainly the city attorney should have looked at that report and said, we're done with this. This one doesn't rise to the level of prosecution.
And I just think, because again, I think it's honestly, and that was back at a time not nearly as litigious and crazy as it is now, where cops are second guessed, on everything. But the safest way to play it is put someone in jail. Yeah. Because if you go to that domestic violence, whether it's in a street, at the bars, or it's at the actual house, you put somebody in jail, you have 100% ensured that you yourself will not be litigated, will not be drawn into some messy, nasty problem, because you separate them.
Right.
They are separated, moving forward, going to the next thing, So I think sometimes that can play into it as well. You play on that. But so, yeah, I agree. I don't know. I think there's a lot of things you could start talking about. Race issues. You could start talking about bias issues. You could start talking about, every city's going to have their areas. You could equate it to the same way as, I'll never forget, we had a very predominantly Hispanic area in our city, what I'm talking about. And on occasion, you drive through there, and I always remember getting stopped by a county guy. And I ID, and we get to the point, I'm like, well, what'd you stop me for? He goes, because you're a white guy.
Isn't that funny?
He goes, you're only here for a couple of reasons. You're here to get in trouble, or you're here to buy some dope. Because a white guy doesn't drive through this part of town at that night. Now, innocent, yeah. I mean, profiling, yeah. But again,
Right.
we've had discussions about
Sure.
profiling, that it's not the evil thing that it is. And he was absolutely right. He's absolutely right. So I mean, you look at this and you flip it around as, some races they draw attention to themselves in certain parts of towns, good, bad, or otherwise.
So, what were you doing in that neighborhood?
Oh, I was working. Yeah, I was working UC. So yeah, because it was kind of funny, because when he pulled me over, it was a good neighborhood to be a little more cautious. So the vehicle stop was a little more I don't want to say by the book, but a little more cautious on the officer's part, until he found out who and what I was, and then had an interesting conversation with the guy. He's pretty forthright about it, and he was 100% right, and I didn't blame him at all.
Well, it's like stopping people at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m.
Right.
Nothing
good happens after 1 or 2 in the morning.
After closing, after the
That's
bar's
right.
closed. So.
That's right. So anyway, but I was glad to see that this one did resolve itself correctly.
Me too.
But the bottom line is, how did it resolve itself correctly? By spending money.
The
guy had to spend money.
He did. He had to spend money. He spent the right money this time, and not the wrong money.
True.
And fortunately, he didn't have his brand. He was retired.
Yeah, he was retired
by this
by
time,
then.
so it didn't have any long-term significant effect on him. Wait, it did have an effect on him. I just remember he was in line to accept a high school coaching job at a very, very prestigious, like 5A. Well, top school in our community.
I forgot about that.
He
You're
was
right.
in line to get that job, and because they were going through a coaching change, and he lost that job because
That's right.
this thing happened. So he had to. So his brand was diminished, and there was a ripple effect.
There was an impact on something that
There was.
he didn't do anything wrong.
He did nothing wrong, and this did financially impact him, and it hurt him in the long term.
I forgot about
Yeah.
that. And keep him from doing something he wanted to do. Because I
Exactly.
remember right, it was,
Yeah.
it's not like the guy necessarily needed money, but it's one of those that you come to a place in your life where you can do work that you really want to do and enjoy.
Yeah.
And it,
and
affected
he'll
that.
be glad. This particular guy will be glad that we discussed this.
Good.
I chatted with it before I came in, and I told him that we may, broach his case and
Sure.
talk to him. He says, "Please do."
Yeah.
He said, "The public ought to know kind of what he experienced if they're interested to listen." And he said, certainly he's going to send it out to as many professional athletes as he can. It's kind of just a testimonial of what he experienced.
A bit of a warning.
Yeah, and they should be a little more cautious, before they have a problem, and
Sure.
and maybe develop do a little forecasting of a problem that might come, and be prepared to handle something that happens to them negatively, and deal with it, not in a moment of crisis, but have a battle plan in place.
Yeah, and we've talked about that. And, the term that I think that I used to use was a fixer. You need a
Right.
fixer, especially when you start talking about these athletes that have so much going on. They have so many different people that are trying to vie for their attention, get their proceeds, get their money, get their time, blah, 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 on and on. You need that fixer, and you need to line your fixer up ahead of time, not when you're in the middle of a big mess.
You do. It's real hard for them to know who that person is though in advance.
Sure.
And then again, there is some racial mistrust between the athletes and then guys like me.
I can see it.
So
Sure.
it's hard to trust a middle-aged and old white man, when they're telling them, what could happen to them, telling them what that could happen, my experiences, sometimes they think I may be trying to work them if I'm having conversations with an athlete before he has this issue. But
Before they have a
before
problem.
they have a problem.
Yeah.
And that without exception, 100% of them come back to me after a problem and say, dude, we were so wrong and so stupid
Right.
not to listen to you and other people that have told us the same.
Right. Because again,
stuff.
it just has such a huge impact. So, you have any other stories that you remember specifics on?
No, I don't. I'm sure there's some out there, Kevin, but I think this gives your listeners a pretty good idea of my experience with professional athletes, and maybe paints a picture of the world that they're navigating their way through post. After they're arrested and have a problem.
Again, I think I know the end from, again, my very brief and negative encounters with professional athletes when I was a cop, and how you came away from that feeling that, well, just negative thoughts. Here's a rich person, has everything they need. Why do they got to be like this? Quite frankly, glad sometimes they got their due, so to speak, to the point that I'm at now where I have a much better understanding. I always remember, I think one of the biggest things, because again, we have a good friend of ours that was another football player with the Cardinals that we did a whole lot of work with. Super good guy, defensive back.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
The movie.
Yeah.
Did the movie. Super good guy. I learned a lot from that guy. And he was pretty smart and savvy.
He
Financially astute, did a really good job that way.
Right.
But he, again, because, unless you're in the game, you don't have the true understanding. And he was really interesting to talk to.
Very.
And I do remember at one point he brought up that, the average NFL career, and again, this was maybe, 5 years ago.
I think so.
4 or 5 years ago, was like a little over 3 years long. And I went, you're kidding me. And that's what he was saying. He's like, no, you got to understand, you get these young guys that they may sign a big contract, but more than likely it's not that great. They play for about 3 years and then they're done.
Yeah.
He's like the majority. He's like, the Tom Brady's and the whoever big football player else you want to name from whatever team. Those guys are the rarity. They're not the example.
Well,
those guys are the exception.
The Tom Brady's
great way to put it. Yeah,
right,
they're the guys protecting the blind side. That
exactly.
They have a career, and then by the time they're in their late 40s, they're half crippled.
I forgot about him, and he is a real smart man. But when we were with him working on that project, he was a sponge too. He was a very down to earth sponge, just absorbing everything that we were sharing with him. And so,
can we say his name?
I think you can. Because it was nothing criminal related.
Nah, and he's a great guy.
Yeah, he was making that a movie reel for his acting.
Yeah, he's trying. Kerry Rhodes. Guy's name's Kerry Rhodes.
Played for the
super
Jets.
Good guy.
Played for the Jets and the Cardinals.
Yeah. Top ranked DB. I mean, the guy was phenomenal. He was a very talented football player. But again, he's the exception. He's not the rule. And, some of the other things that we discussed when we were really working these cases was, the salaries that these guys would make, the discrepancies in, player salaries and how the duration of their careers and a baseball player compared to an NFL, compared to NHL, compared to NBA. I think the one takeaway that I remember the best was I don't think any of those leagues did their players the due diligence and the justice they should have to prepare them.
None of them. Or their agents or their managers.
Yeah.
Which I've had conversations with agents and managers too, and I go, why don't you protect these guys better? And it's in your interest to nurture them more. And they go, listen, they're going to abandon me in a year. There's no loyalty between, the athlete and the agent. So they don't want to invest their time in nurturing them and their behavior.
They don't want to waste their time doing the right thing for these poor kids.
Right, they're looking downrange trying to find the next Dorito to put in the bag with this guy because he's no different than the one that they lost last year.
Yeah.
And then they'll lose the next guy the following year. So there was very little loyalty. And it shocked me that agents and managers didn't shepherd them better than they were doing. Yeah. And getting back to your police comment about how you thought that, and I did too, you thought they were prima donnas. Once you get to know these guys and you spend so much time with them after you're helping them solve a problem or mitigate a problem, you realize that most of them led pretty crappy lives, and their lives only improved once they made the leap between college and the professional leagues, whatever it may be. And even though they got these educational or social passes because they were great in whatever sport they were doing, when you drill down deep enough and you realize what kind of life they led from birth to college, I looked at them a little bit different than I did before because you understand where they came from.
Well, and you come to the realization that athletics was their only out.
That was it.
They had no socioeconomic standing. They had no really opportunity.
No, a
lot of them.
They capitalized on
Not all of them.
One opportunity that they could seize, and I love them for doing that, and I think I respect them for doing that. But they didn't start out there.
No, and I mean, again, we're throwing out a lot of generalities. Of course, there are guys that are different. Of course, I'm sure there's some professional athletes that came up.
I've told you I've fired a couple of them just because I couldn't stand to be around
Sure,
them.
exactly. So again, I think we're just trying to get out there that the misconception is definitely there. And once you get to know these guys and understand what makes them tick, and then they have to, they have their guard up as well. Like you're saying, they got a middle-aged white guy who lived a totally different life trying to talk to this guy who came from a part of town that you can't drive through without getting stopped. You know,
Exactly.
it's two different lifestyles. But once they'd lower their guard, you could definitely see a different side to them.
Oh, completely. And then we
trust.
found a lot of common ground between them. You know,
Right.
I mean, I've never had a client that was long term that didn't. We had a good relationship in the professional client.
Right. Yeah, that you ever look back and you're like, boy, that guy's a real jerk.
No.
You know, you look back, but you have fond memories and you think,
Sure.
you know, they're a good person. And, you know, and again, still, bad things happen to great people.
Well, I've represented professional athletes that did bad things, you
Sure.
know, and but we did the best we could to remedy what they got themselves into. But we move on, and hopefully they took a life lesson from that and didn't repeat it.
Right. Well, I mean, you could say the same thing about someone that's in a different profession.
Absolutely.
I mean, people get themselves in trouble all the time. A lot of guys go to strip clubs that know they probably shouldn't be going to strip clubs. So it's not like this boxer client was doing anything that was completely out of the norm from anybody else. He just happens to be recognizable and a target for some real simple civil litigation potentially, you know?
Yeah, you can't mistake this one.
No. And like we said, the guy hits a lot harder than you can poke. So, no, I'm kind of glad we did the episode. I when we were chatting about it, I wasn't sure if things were going to come together, but I think almost in a sense like, you know, the crux of the podcast was to humanize the side of law enforcement, was to show, you know, some of the things that they deal with and that we're human, that we make mistakes, that, you know, what the job is really about. I think we kind of tried to do the same thing just in an episode with these professional athletes that, you know, they have troubles, they get into trouble based on what they do for a living. Sometimes they're much more prone to get themselves in trouble for a number of reasons, both their own and other people that are around them that interact with them. But yeah, hopefully, you know, you'll kind of come away as the person listening to the podcast with a little better understanding of these folks. So
I think so.
Good. Yeah. I'm glad
Well,
we
I'm
did
glad
it.
we talked about it.
Do you have anything else to add, Jay?
Nothing. Nope. I think that's it, Kevin.
All right. Well, for any potential professional athletes listening, I hope that we did your side justice here. And I know that we have for the guys that we've helped over the years with their issues and everything.
They've all been extremely grateful.
Yeah, definitely. So, all right, guys. Well, hey, with that, I'm going to close this episode of I Barely Got Here. As always, I want to thank you for listening. And if you like the show, please subscribe, post a review, just like Jay's grandchildren, and ask your friends to give it a listen as well. Hey, if you have any questions or comments, you can shoot me an email anytime at ibarelygothehere@gmail.com. And then you can also follow and or comment on Instagram and Facebook. So with that, Sam42
And Grandpa today.
R107. Take care.